Well, you talk about multiple versions, and there have been so many different interpretations of Batman over the years, in every medium, but also in the comic books themselves. Batman won my heart with a comic book called Robin Dies at Dawn. And I think it made me cry as a kid, as I remember it. I mean, I was really moved by that story. And then the next thing that happened was I read, maybe it was Batman Annual #1, and that was my first exposure to the origin story. But it was an expanded origin story with Lou Moxon as well as Joe Chill. And the story seems to change sometimes. Sometimes it just seems to expand. What about this continuity thing? Is it okay to screw with continuity? Is it okay to retrofit it? Is it okay to change it? Or is the thing to do what Frank Miller did and expand and enhance it? What is this? How does this all play in?
Well, first of all, these Superman and Batman, Spider-Man, and a handful of others exist and retain their popularity because they have changed. Mostly the characters have evolved just because they evolved. Comic book writers have traditionally worked under ferocious deadlines. You don't have time to sit down and think something out. You take what's in the air and you make a story of it. The trick is to keep the soul, the essence of the character intact. What is Batman? Basically a lonely man who is almost at the mercy of an obsession. Leave that alone and let everything else change to reflect what's outside the window. Ditto Superman. The Superman that Siegel and Schuster started with in '38 was by 1950, in terms of personality and psychology, unrecognizable. But both were right. I would submit that the characters that have survived and retained their popularity are the characters that were allowed to evolve.
Dan, from the editorial standpoint, like, you've got to bring people in every Wednesday of every year.
You know, it's funny, I'm listening to Denny talk, and I'm like, go for Denny, go! I'm with you every step of the way. It's interesting to me on so many levels what Denny was just saying. The first thing is that I always said that, for me, one of the ways we always test writers is asking for a Batman story, because there's such clarity in who he is and what his motivations are. If you can't tell a story with Batman, then you're not going to have the ability to tell comic stories with superheroes. I think that's so clearly defined. I also find that his origin, when you get down to his origin, it's such a core origin for anybody. It's timeless. You know, children who lose parents, you know, anybody can relate to that, regardless of what movie theater they're coming out to, whenever it occurs.
Any culture around the world.
Anything. There's that loss that you can never overcome.
It's a basic primal childhood fear.
Exactly. And I think that's something that resonates. But more importantly, I agree 100% about evolution. We have to change with the times. I think one of the problems, I'm going to go in for a second, but say one of the problems in comics right now is that we aged with our audience. We didn't stop and say, who are the young guys? Who are the people who want to buy comics now? What do they perceive differently? As a matter of fact, Scott's involved in some things going on with Batman right now that's addressing those very same issues.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'll throw...
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one of the exciting things about working on him. I think right now, under that sort of the administration right now at DC, has been like, we all understand exactly what you guys were saying about that there's a core to Batman that all of us are extremely reverent about. You know, that Batman is about obsession. Batman is about sort of succumbing to your childhood demons. The things that we've been trying to do, or the things that we're excited about, are really sort of bringing our own take to Batman, where it's not necessarily steeped in everything that came before story-wise, but that does justice to sort of the core of the character, but starts to tell stories also that sort of reflect, I think, changing times now and things as they stand in a more contemporary way.
I always have to defer back to Denny again for a second, because one of the things I always think was fun about Batman that stick, and I didn't realize where it came from when I first started at DC, and I always used to say, well, we used to talk about the immutables. What can't change about Batman? And one of the immutables always came back that Batman can't be using guns. And then you start to pry back a little bit, and we realize that was pretty much your edict, from what I understand from Paul Levitz. It was one of your edicts about Batman couldn't use guns, and what was so strong, and I think one of the things that I think helped Batman be so clearly defined for such a generation, is that you had such a long term of involvement, first as a writer and then as an editor, so you were able to reinforce so many key ideas and strengths of the characters over and over again that allowed other people to have such clarity about who he was, because he was so clearly defined, because there was a central focus theme for the books for an extended period of times that other people were able to build on. So there's, like I said, but we always say, why can't Batman use guns? It's because Denny said he couldn't, and now that's good enough for us in the offices.
And that could change.
Yeah, but it works so well for the characters that it doesn't need to change.
Yeah, the same trauma that created him as Batman with the obsession with crime, also in our reading of it, gave him such a reverence for human life. I mean, that's the other side of the Wayne tragedy coin, that he has quietly determined to himself that he will not take the chance of killing somebody unjustly. And the way to do that is not to kill.
And that was
Also, it makes him a little scarier.
Yeah, yeah.
This guy is so tough, he doesn't even need
it was so built in. I mean, saying that, I remember distinctly reading the Year 2 story, the reinterpretation of the Reaper with Joe Chill, where he goes to face Joe Chill, Batman, and he takes his mask off and he says it's the only time he's going to use a gun, or he has the gun, and he's going to, the suggestion is that he's going to shoot Joe Chill or kill him. And I remember how disturbing it was to see that in a comic book, in a good way too. Seeing that he's holding a gun, he's going to use a gun was shocking to me when I saw that in the issue. I remember really distinctly.
In one of the early stories, he did machine gun, wasn't
He
it?
did, yeah.
From a biplane.
He
Well, in
did.
the Cult too. I remember when that came out. The Starlin, that 4-part where he faces that cult of homeless people with Deacon Blackfire, and he has a rifle at one point. And the same thing as a kid, I remember seeing that, and it just strikes you as, this must be something really twisted if Batman is using a gun, because you
I
know
remember
he
talking
doesn't.
to Julie Schwartz when Julie became the editor of Batman for the New Look in 1964. Now, he came over, he knew nothing about Batman. He never paid any attention to Batman, Julie used to say. And in the first story, he has Batman holding a gun in that 1964 Detective, I think it was 327. And everybody came after Julie for that. So you can't do that. He goes, what do you mean? He goes, you can't do it, Batman. So from then on, Julie said, all right, no guns, never a gun, never a gun. Well, things do change. And things evolve, and continuity does get it enhanced, expanded. And we've got somebody with vision by the name of Frank Miller who comes into the scene. Between The Dark Knight Returns, Batman Year One, what did Frank Miller bring to Batman and to comics? What did he do that so shook things up for those of us who write or draw comics and edit comics? What did he do for the fan base? What did he do to the general public and the press? What did all of that mean, and what did it mean for the characters? Let's get into the seminal moment when Frank Miller plops into this.
Well, he's very good at his job. That's the first thing. I mean, as a visual narrator, he's as good as we've ever had. And he played with visual storytelling, but he once told me that he considered himself a writer who learned to draw, not an artist who learned to write. And his concern was always the primacy of the story. A good story well told, to quote Robert McKee. The other thing he brought to it, you mentioned, was the vision. It's a vision that I think is more appropriate to Scott's generation than to ours or mine.
Scott, is that the way your generation sees it?
The thing that spoke to me about Year One in particular first, Year One is my favorite comic book. It was the first time I did see the camaraderie between Jim and Bruce displayed as something that was sort of almost like a diatribe on how lonely it is to be a hero in Gotham in some ways, or to do the right thing. And that there was a sense of honor about that, but a sense of isolation and alienation. And to do that, you'll always be an outcast. It's the first book that I had read also, or the first time I saw Gotham as the enemy in some way, or Gotham as this kind of twisted mirror that they're facing that sort of throws their worst nightmares back at them and challenges them in this very personal way. It was grim. I mean, it was definitely grim, and it was grimmer than I was probably ready for at that time, but it was also exciting because you saw that they found friendship in each other, and there was a bond that would never be broken between them, and that there are other good guys out there that see the ridiculousness of the system.
Something that occurred to me while Scott was talking, that by the time Frank came along, comics had shaken free of that hangover from the witch hunt days, that this has to be goody two-shoes, dumbed down entertainment. By then, you could write stories about real things. Stories that didn't turn on Lois Lane trying to figure out who Superman would look like without the curl, but the same kind of material that storytellers have used for 15,000 years.
So Dan, if comics were growing more sophisticated and more mature by the 1980s, did Year One and The Dark Knight Returns give Batman the opportunity to grow up with his audience?
Oh, I think Batman grew up leaps and bounds at that particular time. I'm just going to add one thing. From Batman Year One, for me, the one thing, because everybody said so many things that I felt about that as well, but the one thing I also felt about Batman Year One is the first time that Gotham City became a place to me, a real location. I mean, Gotham City was always, for me, New York Light or just another name for New York. It was the first time that it felt like, okay, this has its own identity. Now I understand why there's a Gotham City. Now I get it. Now there's a whole different personality, there's a whole different vibe here that doesn't work with New York. It's a city unto itself. So that was kind of cool in its own right. And then also you got to think back also to Batman Returns, or The Dark Knight Returns, I should say. When Dark Knight Returns comes out, it's a different format. It's not even a question, you know? You're talking about maturity. The format of Dark Knight Returns has a mature sensibility. It feels more like a book. It's square bound, you know, heavy paper, different quality, different price, just different sensibilities all come with it. It elevated the maturity of the format, not only just the maturity of the content. And then once you deal, as Scott was saying, is social satire in there, which I think is mostly satire in that book. You realize that you can combine superhero storytelling with a level of satire, but still works on an action level that people can perceive it to be just part of what's going on. There was so much good storytelling in the years leading up to that, but this one sort of grabbed you by the throat. I always say whenever you identify Frank's work to me, I always talk about audacity. You know, it is that self-confidence, incredibly self-confident work, even almost to the point of that it's challenging people to hate it. You know, to the point that I'm going to do so good that I want you to try to hate it, because that's how much I'm going to come at you. But it's surely the sheer audacity in the storytelling.
And there was some outrage.
Yeah.
How dare he show Batman as this almost pathetic middle-aged has-been. That's not heroes. You know that school of thought.
Yeah.
Heroes have to exemplify everything that is good and noble and true.
There was a lot of resistance and backlash at that time.
There was, I caught some rumblings. I would not have been in a position to know exactly how much. But yeah, I got scolded by one of the alcohol rehabilitation organizations because Batman took a drink in there. And I had just recently done a long two-year continuity at Marvel about Tony Stark hitting the bottle too hard and getting hit back. That's what makes editing so frustrating. You don't know where to draw those lines. I mean, my rule of thumb was my own politics and my own belief system does not get into it. My job is to make the creative people do the best job they can.